Welcome to this week's episode of The Path Less Chosen, the podcast showing you careers they don't teach you about in school. My name's Sol.
I'm Jamie.
And this week we have on Inder. And Inder is a nutritional therapist and health coach dealing with people with chronic illnesses. And it's a fascinating topic which is only just being highlighted more and more by COVID. Some fascinating thing that has definitely affected people around me, and I'm so keen to get into it. Jamie, what can we expect from this week's episode?
Yep, definitely a turbulent career path, this one, so looking forward to getting into it. The first thing is the journey of how he went from fine dining in the Mandarin Oriental to working as a nutritional therapist. The second one is how chronic fatigue syndrome changed his life. And the third one is how studying neuroscience can be a baptism of fire.
Hey, can't wait to get him on, and let's get on with it. Inder, thank you so much for coming on The Path Less Chosen. I guess my first question would be, how do you think, in a positive or negative way, has chronic fatigue syndrome actually impacted your life?
You weren't joking. You are starting with a heavy question. I'll be honest. I wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for chronic fatigue syndrome. I mean, when I left school, I thought I'd be working in high-end hospitality and fine dining for the rest of my life, because that's what I really wanted to do. But I think having chronic fatigue syndrome has benefited me in a number of ways. I think perhaps the greatest gift it's given me is the education in nutrition and alternative health, and actually, weirdly, the gift of being able to help my own family. So as an example, like I said, if I just sort of followed the conventional route and left uni and went into high-end hospitality, I would probably be living in the city or whatever, living in another country. But actually, a few of my relatives, my grandmother, for example, had a lot of chronic health conditions. And I ended up working as a carer in the NHS and doing a number of different jobs and qualifying as a nutritionist. And all that knowledge actually allowed me to care for her towards the end of her life. So I actually literally did care for her till the day she passed. So I'd say that is probably the greatest gift and positive thing, definitely. That's probably what I'd say.
Yeah, amazing. I think for context, it's important for people to be aware, actually, your path started down a fine dining route, which is a far cry from what you're doing now. So just to fill in the gaps before we get into exactly what's led you to where you are now, what was it that led to that transition, and talk us through that period of time where it's kind of led you from fine dining to where we are today?
Sure. So, I've always, I think the name of this podcast is very fitting, because I've always sort of had a very, how can I say, contradictory or perverse way of looking at things in life. You know, I went to a school that churned out accountants, doctors, lawyers.
Me too.
Yeah, so, city people who pretty much had a very sort of, I don't want to say obtuse, but followed a certain pathway. And they all tend to live in the same part of London and have the same group of friends and everything. But for me, I always just saw the world differently, and I think that was because I had sort of like an Indian working class grandparents who came here first generation, and I kind of had one foot in both worlds, if you like. And being Asian as well, we generally tend to have a more holistic approach to life in terms of healthcare, for example. But yeah, so I at school I studied chemistry, biology, economics. Really enjoyed that, but I developed this sort of obsession about halfway through sixth form, thanks to a show called The Great British Menu. I don't know if you guys remember that, on the BBC. Sort of like, a lot of Gordon Ramsay's chefs it's like basically a cooking competition between chefs, and the winner would cook for the Queen on her birthday or something like that. And anyway, I remember watching that like on a school holiday, and it just ignited this fire inside of me. I don't know what it was. I have no idea. Maybe it was just because it was just so different from kind of the school and environment that I was from. But absolutely loved it. And and actually, funnily enough, it's probably not a coincidence, but my best friend's dad worked in high-end hospitality for the Savoy. He was director of sales for Savoy. Wow. And I often, during the holidays, would like go with Johnny, with my friend on the train to London to like go see his dad and have dinner with his dad in the Savoy. And that kind of just sort of amplified that fascination and the fire within me. So anyway, a long story short, became pretty obsessed actually with hospitality. And then, ended up studying hospitality in my undergrad at Sussex, having a great time. Then got a job working for Heston Blumenthal in the Knightsbridge. He just opened a restaurant called Dinner by Heston Blumenthal in the Mandarin Oriental. So I did that for a while, and then basically developed chronic fatigue syndrome about, a couple of years. So I was about 20, 21. And life pretty much turned upside down. It was sort of like having everything was fine, and then just came down with these flu-like symptoms. Was in bed for a couple of days, and then basically didn't get out of bed for about 5 years. And again, a long story short, and I've said that twice now. I ended up bouncing between lots of different doctors and practitioners of all persuasions, and no one was really able to help. And this was at a time, this was sort of like 2010-ish, 2011, when the concepts of nutrition and chronic fatigue and long COVID, fibromyalgia, all these things were completely abstract. And I mention long COVID because long COVID is actually, I think, raised a lot of awareness about chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. Anyway, a long story short, ended up meeting a nutritional therapist through serendipity. Literally just happened to meet this woman in a health food shop, and she introduced me to this guy who basically recognized what I had, was able to help me. And over the course of about 4 years, sort of got me to a state where I was kind of able to start moving forward with my life, and ended up retraining as a nutritional therapist, and then later a neuroscientist as well.
God, I love how you say that so flippantly, as if that's like a dead simple thing to do. But I mean, to begin with, though, it'd be really interesting to kind of understand what your mindset was like, because that's not a short period of time. Like, you've talked about 4 or 5 years there, where you're kind of bedbound and you're in a really difficult position where the life of what you were living in the fine dining space is probably unlikely for you to ever go back to it again. So explain a little bit, what was your mindset then? Did you have something in mind of, when I'm kind of in a position to be able to, this is the path I'm going to go down with my career, and I'm going to totally change things up? At what point did that light bulb moment go off where you decided to switch, and when did it become possible, really?
So, I suppose I make it sound like it was a very short period of time and it was quite easy. So I remember probably a year into my recovery working with this nutritional therapist, I started to get some energy back. And I sort of was in this sort of in between a rock and a hard place where I wasn't well enough to like resume a full-time job, but I also wasn't sick enough to just stay in bed all day and sleep. And my dad actually suggested volunteering for the Alzheimer Society. So ended up, driving to, I live in Windsor, so driving to Harrow twice a week, and looking after these elderly people with Alzheimer's. And weirdly, one of my biggest symptoms was brain fog, actually. And sometimes when I get really tired and stressed, that still comes back. So it sounds crazy, bearing in mind I was probably only 23 at the time. But I kind of empathized and could relate quite a lot to those elderly people with Alzheimer's. Because I kind of knew what it was like when you could see that they were trying to say something, and they were frustrated and sort of angry. I knew that exact feeling, because it was like my brain was behind a vault. Like I went from being able to just read and talk and socialize to literally really struggling to just say a basic sentence. So it was sort of during that time that I thought, God, I really want to I remember the day, that was the moment when I thought, I really want to work with patients who have brain and cognitive symptoms. So that was probably the time, I would say. And actually it was that moment when I decided I'm going to do an MSc in neuroscience, because that was sort of where I thought, because at that time I obviously benefited from nutritional therapy, and I saw all these patients with brain issues, and I thought, I've got to try and find a way of marrying those two together and trying to bridge what sort of mainstream neurologists do with kind of what I do as a nutritional therapist.
Yeah.
So been on that journey for a few years now.
God, that's incredible, because I imagine it could have been really easy to kind of just take a backward step. You had an excuse there where you were like, well, I don't really have to do something like this. So the fact that actually you twisted it and you were like, you know what, I've been kind of inspired to go down this path because it's something that's really helped me and changed my life for the better, right? And then you've been able to turn it into a career. So I think that's fantastic. I think obviously your trigger for doing that whole retraining and the change with your career path was the fact that you were struggling with something yourself, and this was something that made the difference. But I think there'll be a lot of people that will probably get to some kind of crisis point, or a point at least where they're doing a bit of self-reflection and thinking, you know, what's going to be good for me? Maybe I need to take a backward step and totally retrain as well. it would be good to get an insight, how easy realistically, and your honest insights as to how was it to totally retrain into something you've not done before and totally change which direction your career path was going into. I think
It sounds a bit weird, but I'm probably not the best person to ask because I have always had, from a very early age, a very broad set of interests and skills. I've always been an all-rounder. I think, for example, at school, I did sort of like 6 A-levels, which ranged from like biology, chemistry, economics, Spanish, maths, and English. And like, I don't know maybe it was the school I went to, I don't know, but I've always just had a very broad outset. And I've kind of always liked the idea of having a broad range of interests and a very broad knowledge set to be able to apply to any field. And I think and I think I've always been like that. And I think that approach kind of definitely lent itself very well to what I do now. So when I decided to retrain as a nutritional therapist, for example, it was a 3 or 4 year course. It wasn't a huge jump because I'd already kind of been there already, but I was also interested in it. Neuroscience, I would say, is slightly different. That was a baptism of fire. That was a hellish 2 years. That was a completely different way of thinking. So your question was about what advice would you have for these people who are thinking about retraining. You've got to really want to do it. I think that it's hard, especially when you've got a full-time job and you've got a mortgage, you've got rent, you've got kids, family to look after. You've got to have a burning desire to be able to sacrifice your weekends or sacrifice an hour every day to commit to it. I've always been quite an obsessive person. I think from a very young age as well, I've been pretty tenacious. If I've had my mindset on something, I just hold on to it and I just don't let it go. I'm also probably the kind of person, like I do a lot of lecturing now. I teach and I give a lot of talks to companies, and I'm probably my own worst critic. Like I'm really hard on myself, and I have this, and it's not good, and I've worked on it a lot. But I have a very perfectionist tendency. I'm an all or nothing type of person, so I have this what I would describe as an obsessive, burning desire type of tendency. So if you don't have that thing that just totally grabs you, then it's probably not the best thing to do, in my experience.
Interesting. And I guess it's like on the topic of kind of sunk cost fallacy, which is even though there is the ability for you to say you went down one route, I'm sure your previous journey helped a lot with your current journey now.
100%. And ironically, I'm actually giving a talk to a hospital group, and there's some weird parallels between hospitality and being a healthcare practitioner, because they're both kind of in the service industry. You're looking after people, you're providing customer service, you got to listen. I think whether you're working in a 5-star hotel or a McDonald's or you're treating patients, it's all about listening and trying to hear what the customer or the patient is saying and trying to anticipate their needs, and trying to just give and making them feel special as well. I often say, my typical sort of patient or client have been similar to me, probably have been sick for at least 5 to 10 years. What's interesting is they don't necessarily come to see me because they want the protocol, they want the remedies or the drugs or the supplements to make them better. They want somebody to listen and understand their situation, which is a bit weird because it kind of like makes me think I should have just become a therapist instead. But I've got a friend who's a cardiologist, and she finds a similar thing. Like people often don't necessarily want medical care or medical advice. They want somebody to listen and understand. And hospitality definitely gave that to me. Absolutely, 100%.
And I've actually got a close friend who kind of suffers from chronic fatigue and long COVID symptoms, and it's so interesting the kind of this space that is appearing because of long COVID, but obviously has existed for such a long time before. So I'm so keen to hear a bit more about how the space has developed and how you've kind of positioned yourself within it.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, my experience started probably in 2010, 2011. I mean, chronic at the time, most doctors would if you said, we've got fatigue and I'm just tired and I can't get out of bed, it was still the days where doctors would say, oh, it's all in your head, or run it off, or do some exercise. So the space has changed hugely. I think, as I mentioned, COVID has definitely accelerated that awareness. It's a funny one because chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and possibly long COVID are still very niche areas, and funding has been quite limited from government sources in general. Most of the research that funds chronic fatigue is actually funded by rich patients who have had them themselves, literally across the board. I mean, I worked for a company called the Gupta Program for a short while, and it's like a psychological program to try and reverse chronic fatigue. And they're conducting clinical trials in conjunction with universities. It's all private donors, and across the board. So the biggest change I would say is definitely there is now empirical objective evidence to suggest that people with chronic fatigue, certainly chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia is different, but chronic fatigue, so these people with chronic fatigue have objective abnormalities in their immune system. And we don't quite know exactly what that means, but there are objective measures now to suggest that somebody's immune system with chronic fatigue is different from someone without it.
I'd love to just touch on the kind of societal aspect of it, because I know that it is something that people do really like. There's definitely this massive stigma around it. So I'd love to hear on your personal experiences, as well as the experiences that I'm sure you see patients dealing with every single day. What is the perception of this, and how much does it actually affect your line of work and the people you're dealing with?
So I think there is still a big proportion of people who think chronic fatigue syndrome is just, I don't want to sound condescending, but people who think that chronic fatigue is just all in somebody's head and that it's sort of made up, and people are lazy. That's a big one that you still hear today. People are lazy. I often deal with a lot of females. It tends to affect more females whose husbands are giving them a hard time because they think they're making it up. They're attention seeking. And they've got some mental issue or psychological issue. It's crazy. So I'd say, and I don't, to be honest with you, it may sound surprising, I don't blame them, because I describe chronic fatigue as a physical illness without a doubt, but it's invisible. So and it makes it extremely difficult for those people who struggle. One good thing now is that there is increasing awareness. And when often it's couples who come to see me, normally it's the wife, but the husband will come or the boyfriend will come. And once I've shown them some evidence and talked to them about my experience and other patients' experience, they start to see that it is real, that there is something there that we just can't put our finger on. And it's like dementia, as an example. We can't see it. That's the issue with a lot of brain conditions. They're invisible illnesses. And I think one great thing about AI is hopefully that it will accelerate the learning curve and the research curve, so that we have more evidence and more information and more solutions available to these people.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned solutions at the end there, because I think that's ultimately what you're now doing as a career. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear, firstly, what was that significant difference that a nutritional therapist made to you that's allowed you to obviously be able to then go on to work? And then what do you do day to day now as a nutritional therapist that is making clearly quite a big difference to people's lives?
So this is going to sound a bit woo-woo. The nutritional therapist I saw is a nutritional therapist, but he also has this skill set called kinesiology. I don't know if you've heard of it. So he's a kinesiologist, and in essence, he's able to tap into the body's energy and precisely pinpoint what the root causes of symptoms are. And then even cooler than that, he's able to actually identify remedies, whether that's supplements or herbs, for example, that can address and address those symptoms and potentially reverse. It's a slightly grey area to talk about, but without a doubt, that kinesiology system, whatever it is, worked for me tremendously. Personally, I had and it's very common with chronic fatigue, a viral infection that is innate. So we have a lot of viruses such as Epstein-Barr, I'm sure we've all heard of that now, cytomegalovirus, human herpes viruses, the herpes family generally. We all have them, about 90% of the population carry them around. But what happens is, for various reasons, stress, other infections, acute infections, environmental toxins, lots of different things, trauma, can suppress the immune system for a short period of time. That can allow that infection that's been dormant in the system to come back up. So in my case, that virus was HHV6. So we did some work, well, the kinesiologist did some work to try and with using supplements, so things like humic acid, for example, was very beneficial. There's a herb called tacuna that comes out of the Amazon, and they bind to the virus as it jumps from cell to cell. So yeah, for the first year or so, it took a good year to actually clear that out, using supplements and supporting the liver pathways as well, because viruses love to hang out in the liver. So it was a complicated process, but yeah, essentially inhibiting the virus, supporting the liver, rebalancing the mitochondria, because viruses can cause a lot of damage to the mitochondria. And yeah, it was a combination of things that got me better.
So then now you've built your own clinic around that concept, right? So talk us through what that involved and how it works from the day-to-day of what you're now doing with that.
Yeah, so interestingly, I see less chronic fatigue patients now, largely because I still don't have the kinesiology skill set, but I am learning it. My area is more supporting people with neuro issues, actually, so unsurprisingly. So I see a lot of Alzheimer's, I see a lot of Parkinson's patients, I see a lot of stroke patients, so patients who've had 1 or 2 strokes and trying to prevent another stroke coming back. A lot of heart disease as well, which, interesting, there's a saying in neurology, which is what's good for the heart is good for the, what is good for the heart is good for the brain. So we do a lot of work supporting people's cardiovascular system, and that can have a massive benefit for people with dementia. But essentially what I do is a combination of using therapeutic supplements, making dietary changes, lifestyle change. As I mentioned at the beginning, a large part of what I do is listening and actually trying to care for people psychologically, because there is without a doubt, a strong connection between past trauma, even current trauma, and development of chronic disease. And I don't think you can address one without the other. So yeah, I spend a lot of time actually coaching people and trying to boost their psychology and boost their resilience as well.
Wow. In your line of work, I guess because you started out in the fine dining space, it's got a reputation of being something that's quite stressful. But is it not incredibly stressful to be able to have to run a clinic where you're helping a real array of people that are coming to you where they want to speak to you about their problems, when you've obviously gone through your own personal struggles? Does that make it easier or harder when it obviously relates to something that you've been through personally?
If it sounds a bit strange, I mean, it may not sound strange, but it's been a while since I've been better. So I'll be honest, I've kind of partly forgotten what it was like to be back in that hole. And this is one thing about chronic fatigue as an example. It's a situation, it's a set of symptoms that you cannot describe unless you've been in it. And it's kind of, I always describe it like having a run-in with a dementor from Harry Potter, literally just sucking you completely dry and totally zapped. And it's just a very weird situation. It's a bit like deep depression as well. You only know what that's like if you've been in it. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't affect me personally too much now dealing with patients like that. I enjoy it. It's really rewarding just being able to hear someone's story and be like, I know exactly where you've been, and I know exactly what it's like. I find that a bit rewarding. But as I mentioned as well, I'm human, and if I overdo it, my symptoms can sometimes come back. So for me, it is a balance of being aware when I'm sort of overwhelming myself and possibly absorbing other people's stuff, and just relying on some healthy coping mechanisms. For me, like walking, music, playing the piano, probably see in the background. A series of coping mechanisms to try and offset some of that negativity.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear, and yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and I guess to take a bit of a wider lens on it, that we seem to have so many people on this podcast who went down one career path and then were, for some reason or of their own choice, went down another career path. So how's it actually for yourself to know, to have those two careers to compare against? And I guess I'd love to hear your reflections on how much of a positive or negative impact it's had on your life to be able to pivot into what you're doing now.
So they are completely, first thing I'd say, these two careers are completely different in terms of lifestyle. Like, I no longer live on a rota. I don't really work long hours. There's no real socializing. I've gone from being working in a very, very sort of social extrovert environment to actually going into a room with no windows, working one-to-one with people. And I'll be honest with you, that bit I find really hard, because I'm quite extrovert myself. And like working one to one, it's even though you're with people, you don't necessarily, they're clients and patients, so you're not necessarily having a personal conversation. So I find that transition hard. I found that transition hard, and sometimes I do, like if there are gaps in my diary, for example, I find that quite hard because I'm by myself, and it's almost like I've got nowhere to go. Like I can work from home or I can go to the clinic. I find that a bit really hard. I'm not going to lie. But I've just started working remotely, actually, just going to like cafes, just to see people, just to see people I know. So that lifts me up quite a lot, and I'm quite productive. What else would I say? Yeah, so it gets lonely, but I'm somebody who's I've always been very creative as well, and I love the idea of waking up in the morning, kind of. I don't know how can I say this without sounding flippant. I kind of like waking up in the morning feeling like I'm in the shit, because I love being able to try and problem solve my way out of it. It's a bit like, oh, I haven't got so many clients today, how do I get more? Or I haven't got so many speaking gigs, how do I get more? I just love that feeling of being able to wake up and go, you know what, I can take the business in any direction I want. I love that flexibility and that ability to be creative, and that's a real blessing to me.
Love that.
That's so cool. And actually, like, firstly, thank you for sharing the kind of negative aspect of and the lonely, because I think we definitely don't want to glorify entrepreneurship or starting your own thing necessarily on this podcast more than it needs to be, because everyone always talks about the freedom you get and the kind of different life you can live. But it's so interesting to hear that part about the kind of the feeling lonely aspect.
100%. And if I could just say something else on that. As you say, there is a perception that you start your own business and it's like, I'm free. But actually, you've probably heard this a few times, you've actually got to work twice as hard to basically work for yourself and get the business off the ground. You've got to work twice as hard. And someone very wise in my life said to me once that, she's been around for like, God knows, 40 years. And she rented an office somewhere. And over the years, she saw people come in and out of those offices for various reasons. Some of them started businesses and they failed, or some people started a business and they blew up and they needed bigger premises. And she said she observed something between those guys who had to pack up their business and the guys who really expanded. And she said she found that the guys who worked for the corporates generally tended to come into the office, cock of the walk, used to picking up the phone and saying, "Hi, I'm Joe Bloggs from Microsoft. Do you want my product?" And they're used to people sitting up in their chairs and saying, "Yeah, of course we want to work with you," to all of a sudden going to, "Hi, I'm Joe Bloggs and I work for Inder Limited. This is my product. Are you interested?" "No, fuck off." And then hearing that 100 times a day, the guys who work for the corporates generally can't handle that because they're not used to it, because they've literally had opportunity. They've just had pipelines and they've had opportunities constantly. But the guys who actually left school and maybe worked for a couple of small businesses, or left uni and worked for some small businesses or did their own thing for a while, kind of they're not used to being told yes. And that was actually probably one of the hardest things when I started, because like there's a lot of nutritionists, there's a lot of doctors, and it was being told no. I'm not going to lie, I'll be really honest. Like when I started the business, probably the first 3-4 months, at least once a week, I'd go for a walk and probably cry. Because I was like, nobody wants me, nobody's interested. And I was lucky, full disclosure as well, my mum's in business development. So I kind of leaned on her a little bit and some of her advice. And she'd been there as well, because she took a company that she worked for from very small turnover to 8-figure turnover. But anyway, I'm digressing. But the point being, not being able to, or being able to accept the answer no and moving on and pushing forward, not everybody is cut out for that. And actually being able to live on your savings or live on an overdraft for a while your company's not receiving any income, and being able to tolerate that pain and push through, not everybody is cut out for that.
Yeah. No, that's such a beautiful way to finish it, because I think obviously it's a really important thing for people to bear in mind, that the reality of it is not always glamorous, right? But fair play to you. You've obviously built something that's now successful. You continue to build it. I love that mentality that you wake up every morning looking for more possibilities. I think that's brilliant. And so then to kind of lead towards the end of the conversation, it'd be good to understand where you're thinking of taking this. Like, is it something that you can expand the clinic to other locations around the UK? Or is it something you want to keep really personal to yourself? What does the future hold for you?
So as I mentioned, sort of one of my big goals is to try and bridge what I do with mainstream neurology care. You know, I like the idea of there being sort of one of me in every NHS/private neurology clinic. Wow. So a neurologist makes a diagnosis, potentially prescribes drugs or physiotherapy or whatever is required, but then he immediately refers the patient to me to be able to address the diet and the lifestyle. That is something I'm really trying to work towards at the moment. And interestingly, again, if you know, 3-4+ years ago, neurologists would tell you to piss off. They were just not interested. But I've been having some really interesting conversations with younger neurologists who are definitely aware, especially since COVID as well, because patients are coming in with these funny, funky symptoms, weakness and numbness and neuropathies and weird symptoms. They're being given very strong drugs, very expensive drugs, and they're sort of seeing marginal benefit, but then they relapse. And neurologists are a bit like, okay, I don't know what to do. They can't do any harm improving your diet. Like there's definitely no evidence to suggest that improving, you know, eating more vegetables is harmful. So neurologists are definitely becoming more open-minded to it, definitely. And secondly, my other big goal is actually speaking. It's something, when I was sort of literally in bed, you know, for those few years in my 20s, one of my big goals was to speak, to try and do public speaking, because I kind of always, as I mentioned, I'm quite creative, and you can probably tell I like talking and expressing, and that was one of the things that was taken away from me when I had chronic fatigue, just the ability to speak and to be able to read a book and really understand it and talk about it. So yeah, that's also another big goal for me, is to try and do a lot more speaking, public speaking to companies and to lay people and to practitioners as well.
And very, very cool to hear that you're looking to expand as well. And I think to get your thought process out in the world would be very cool. So thanks for sharing that, Inder. And we always ask our guests the same last question. So if you were to go back to that time, like if you were to go back to like the time maybe you were on the walk, then just one thing you do the same, one thing you do differently, and one thing you tell yourself to motivate yourself.
I think the one thing I would say to motivate myself, I'll start there. There's no pleasure without pain, and you've got to cut your teeth, and you've got to endure some hardship to reap the rewards. I think one thing, just as a slight digression, I think one thing that, how can I say, maybe the media, maybe a lot of these people on podcasts and YouTube channels and social media, all these entrepreneurs and people the like, they make setting up a business sound really glamorous and really easy, but it's really not. And people glorify that struggle, but it's really not. And you know, how can I say? I think what I'm trying to say is they make their job sound very easy, or they make their success sound very easy. Like they set up this business, they released a few social media posts, and bang, 20,000 leads came in. It's not like that, and nobody ever tells you that actually for every social media post you post, only 5 whatever it is 0.2% are actually going to like it and engage with it. So I would say the thing to motivate myself, I would say it's normal where you are. Most people who have done well have actually been there, and they just haven't admitted it. I think that's what I was trying to say. They've been there and they just haven't admitted it. So this is normal. Feel it. This is the way it should be, because like anything in life, it takes more energy to get something rolling than it does to keep it rolling. So sorry, that was a long answer, but yeah. So to motivate myself, I would say that this is I am where I should be, and it should be tough, and this is normal. Something I would do differently, I would say, don't be so hard on yourself. Don't worry, be crappy has become a motto, actually, in my life. Don't worry, be crappy. Don't worry about getting it to 100%. Just do your best and leave the rest. Like, don't stress. Like, I used to stress so much about getting a perfect presentation prepared, and actually I just realized I wasted so many days and hours on something that actually yielded very little as a result. So Just don't worry, be crappy, and you're always going to get better. So yeah, that was to motivate. That was to do differently. And then did you say the thing I would do the same? What would I do the same? Just keep going. That's what I would say. Just keep going. It sounds crazy. Sometimes in life, you don't have to do anything big or magic. This is something a wise friend told me once, who sold his business for a lot of money. He said, sometimes in life, you don't have to do anything big or magic. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes you've just got to put one foot in front of the other and just keep going.
Into that. So good. Well, thank you very much, Inder, and what a great way to end. Really appreciate coming on, and some very wise words in there, and some very candid words as well, which is always appreciated throughout people's journey. So yeah, looking forward to seeing where you go in the next few years, and we'll definitely be keeping in touch. So appreciate your time, and yeah, looking forward to seeing that.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, really good. Yeah, I enjoyed that episode with Inder. Obviously a fascinating world. I imagine no 2 days are ever the same for him, and he gets to see some really interesting stuff, but I imagine it's a very rewarding career as well. So I think a few takeaways, if you're happy for me to start. I think the first one that I would go for, which I think is a really important message that anyone can really apply, and hopefully this is something that will resonate with you, Sol, given what you've done recently. But he says that if you're in a certain career and you decide that you want to retrain or change direction completely and go down a different path, it's got to be something that you're definitely sure you really want it. Because at the end of the day, it's going to require a lot of sacrifices. You know, there's a lot of life circumstances that may be in play that make things difficult. But if you can't give up your weekends and certain hours, like unsociable hours that require a lot of sacrifice, then it makes retraining and changing that direction of your path a lot harder. And I think that was the message that he shared, which I think is really, really useful for anyone to bear in mind. Make sure you want it enough to make those sacrifices worth it when you're going to change direction.
Nothing to add there, I think. Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. My key takeaway actually was something which is interesting, that I found it so fascinating that he said that he had those like lonely periods. I think that's just such an underappreciated thing in entrepreneurship. And my key takeaway from that, which I truly believe in, and is one of the reasons that I'm sat in Dubai right now, is that when you're in a business where it is pretty much you building it, the importance of being surrounded by people that are doing the same thing or can relate to your problems is like one of the key bits of longevity. And I think in general, if you're on a path less chosen, surrounding yourself with the right sort of people to help, like either help you directly with your business, or just like the people that can understand your problems is so important. So my takeaway is surrounding yourself with people to help you on your journey.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there's a few little points that he touched on in that answer, like around, working for yourself. He talked about working twice as hard for yourself, but I think it was really interesting, the point about how sometimes it does get lonely, and as you've actually got to find ways of being proactive and seeing people and finding a way that will actually work, so you avoid that loneliness to an extent. So yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I like that answer in its entirety, to be honest. I think the final takeaway I'd go for is the idea of learning to love to solve problems. I think he said that he has that genuine hunger inside him, that if he's waking up every single day and there's gaps in his schedule where he's like, well, I could be seeing a client here, I could be making a difference to someone's life, then he's seeing that as a really exciting challenge. He's like, okay, well, there's something I can do better, something I can do bigger, and I can grow the business to make sure those gaps are being filled. And if he wasn't enjoying what he was doing and it wasn't a path that he felt really passionate about, that wouldn't be the case. But he's adopted this mindset where he genuinely wakes up loving the idea that today he's going to solve some problems for either his business or for other people. And I think that's a great mindset to be in, regardless of the path you're going down.
100%. Like relishing that challenge, and also knowing that you're kind of romanticizing something which a lot of people will be like, oh, I don't want to solve problems. That's crap. But actually romanticizing that, I think, is one of the keys to entrepreneurship and starting your own business. Okay, to sum up, very simply, enjoying and accepting the facts that you're going to have to be making sacrifices. Second is finding ways to be proactive to deal with your loneliness in entrepreneurship. And the third is loving and romanticizing problem solving. So yeah, amazing episode. Was lovely to chat to Inder, and what a cool guy doing seriously cool work in a field that is becoming ever so important and now so interesting because of the kind of highlights that COVID has brought to it. So yeah, excited to see what happens with him in the next few years. and hopefully very interesting episode for people in general. So yeah, if you enjoyed that episode, please tell your friends. We get a lot of listeners by people just saying, oh, have you heard these two random guys who are chatting about careers and cool paths you can take? So we'll catch you in next week's episode, and thanks very much for listening.